Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to the New Books and World Affairs podcast. My name is Jeffrey Gordon, and today I'm talking to Zach Sell about his new book, Trouble of the World, Slavery and Empire in the Age of Capital, released in January 2021 from the University of North Carolina Press. The middle decades of the 19th century witnessed the expansion of slavery and white settlement and dispossession of indigenous lands west of the Mississippi River, the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, followed by the importation of indentured laborers from India and China into the West Indies, the consolidation of British rule in India, followed by the so-called Indian Mutiny, and the expansion of settler colonialism in Australia. These processes were all tied together by commerce, empire, and the spread of racial ideologies, yet their histories have largely been written separately until now. Zach Sell's book, Trouble of the World, highlights the connections between the second slavery in the deep south of the United States, efforts to socially engineer monocrop agriculture in India by a British colonial state that paid lip service to laissez-faire and free labor even as it tried to import plantation management techniques from the U.S. South. The book covers the attempt to create plantation-style agriculture in Queensland, Australia, and how this bumped up against the logic of white settler colonialism. And it covers attempts to expand plantation agriculture in Belize in the age of so-called free labor using indentured labor from Asia. This is a story of racial formation on a global scale and of the limits of capital's ability to remake social relations and environments in its own image, despite the capacity for organized brutality that it had at its disposal. This book is particularly important at a time when many American, British, and French commentators have tried to downplay the violence of expansion and colonialism and to portray white supremacy as some sort of American peculiarity and relic of the past. Zach is currently visiting assistant professor of history at Drexel University and was previously Ruth J. Simmons postdoctoral fellow and visiting assistant professor of slavery and justice at Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Zach, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to be here.
So, Zach, how did you become interested in writing about slavery, empire, and capital in the 19th century?
Thanks. That's a really important question. And I just, again, want to say thank you for the opportunity to talk about my book and also acknowledge that we are recording this really a year into when the ramifications of the global pandemic took root in the United States and dramatically disrupted life and livelihoods, no doubt, as well. And I wanted to sort of acknowledge that at first because of the kind of like massive loss that has happened in the past year, but also and in a much less significant way, but personally meaningful perhaps, is to acknowledge it because it was exactly in those months that I finished the book and submitted it for publication. So Trouble of the World, though, began as a dissertation project at the University of Illinois. I was really motivated by a concern about how to write histories of race, colonialism, and empire that extended beyond what, at least within the field of history, were common organizing frames, such as discrete national histories or empires. And it also was concerned with the way in which U.S. slavery structured patterns of relation, especially within capitalism. It drew upon, and draws upon multi-sided archival research and was really based upon a belief that that research could reveal different aspects in the history of capitalism, slavery, and colonialism, particularly in their interaction. And the book was really motivated also by a lot of kind of like field-defining scholarship from what I would describe as race, capitalism, and colonialism studies. In the 10 years since I began working on the project, this field has really dramatically transformed and, drawn a lot from the influences including from Lisa Lowe, Walter Johnson, Tony Bogues, Chris Manjapra, David Roediger, Antoinette Burton, just to name a few people. And I think also, so I finished the book, I finished the project as a dissertation and had the opportunity, as you mentioned, to work on kind of like transforming it at Brown University Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. And it was really there, I think, that the book took a new form to think a little bit more deeply and conceptually around questions of what the kind of like deeper structural and political histories of race and capitalism were in their interaction. And I think there I would just particularly like to note the deep influence that Anthony Bogues had on my thinking and kind of like the community that he created there. So.
That's fantastic. And I think that books like yours are so important because they try to write histories of capitalism and race formation outside of and beyond the national frame, and highlight connections between distinct regions. Um, your book goes from the U.S. South to India to Australia to Belize. Um, what are some of the challenges and trade-offs involved in writing a book of such immense geographical scope? And what are some of the sources that you used and archives that you visited?
Yeah, so that's a really important question, and I think that the kind of like question of trade-offs and payoffs, I'd frame in this way. So, there's the great scholar of imperialism and colonialism, Catherine Hall, at one point writes that different colonial projects provide access to different meanings of empire, different ways in which to understand the history of empire, and when working on this project, I was really inspired by that observation to try to think of how multi-sided archival research could produce in some ways, or at least engender new questions about how one might understand the history of capitalism, not according to discrete nation states, not according to discrete empires, but through dynamic interaction. And so, in that, I think there's a lot of kind of like interpretive purchase and power, but I also think that there's limitations, and sometimes there's limitations in which a project like this might be kind of like seen and read. And I think that there's a tendency when one writes a project that's based upon kind of like multi-sided and, in a certain sense, global history, to conflate that with kind of like a history of the world or something like that, a history of everything that exists. And that's not really what the ambition of this project is, but rather it's kind of like ambition, I think, is to try to reorganize in some ways the way in which capitalism and empire in the mid-19th century can be understood through interactions, particularly between U.S. slavery and the British imperial world in the period between emancipation in the British Empire and Black emancipation in the United States. And I think by focusing on that period, we can see kind of like the ways in which really global formations of capital and empire become increasingly violent in new and quite unexpected and unanticipated ways.
Right. And I think that the global history movement, as you said, is not necessarily about a history of everything. It's a history of connection. And here, Gurmindar Bhambra's work on historical sociologies of connection is what I have in mind as a direction I would like to see comparative politics go in, more in highlighting relations and connections between distinct histories and distinct processes, and seeing how the interactions and transactions between discrete projects or discrete locations shaped the trajectory of these processes. I see it as more of a complement to local or national histories rather than some kind of substitute for them, because it highlights these multi-sided connections. And I noticed, and didn't necessarily write this down in a question, but I noticed that along these lines of focusing on connections, that there's a little bit of influence of work on anthropologies and geographies of logistics. And in here, I noticed you cite Deborah Cohen's work on the violence of supply chains, and Anna Lowenhaupt Singh's book, Friction, an ethnography of global connection. How were you influenced by some of this more contemporary social theorizing about connections and supply chains?
Yeah, that's a really terrific question. I think that particularly Anna Singh's really wonderful work, whether it be Friction or sort of writing about scale, I think really helped me think of how to kind of like reorganize my project, or think differently about how it was ultimately going to look in its final form. So I think one of the things that Singh says that's so profound and important is that history cannot be organized, or social processes can't be organized according to sort of precision nested scales, and instead global social processes flow across kind of like these scalar geographies or modes of looking. And so I think that was, really important to consider. And similarly, writing on logistics, I think was, really influential in trying to think of how capital was organized on a global scale in the mid 19th century. And so those works are just some of the many that I was influenced by in working on the project, but of great importance, no doubt.
Yeah, the new work on critical logistical studies has really been super interesting to me, just because it takes these processes that so many people take for granted, in terms of just having things delivered on time, and unpacks the political conditions of possibility for logistical processes. And I think that influence comes through a little bit in your work, particularly as we'll discuss in your chapter on your chapters on colonial India and the efforts by the colonial state to construct new relations between places within the subcontinent by constructing infrastructural projects. I also wanted to talk to you about, speaking of intellectual influences, the role that the Black radical tradition played in shaping your interpretation and your conceptualization of the project. W.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, Walter Rodney, Eric Williams, Sylvia Wynter, Cedric Robinson, they all come up throughout the pages of your book, and I really see one of the strengths of your project as kind of challenging this long-standing epistemological segregation and erasure that has marginalized Black, Indigenous, and Southern political and social thought. Describe the influence that these Black radical scholars have had on your thinking about this project.
Yeah, so I think, another really important point, and something that structures a lot of different aspects of the book, is the way in which, especially some of the authors that you noted, and I guess I would highlight first W.E.B. Du Bois, kind of engaged in, and this is most dramatic in is Black Reconstruction, kind of like a radical critique and rethinking of how capitalism could be understood from the perspective of Black emancipation in the United States, and through that history also to understand kind of like redefinitions and ultimate betrayals of Black freedom, and to draw upon sort of the real global implications of Black emancipation. And so that work is of great importance, and I think similarly, and just to kind of like continue on that point, is the way in which subsequent scholars have called for considering how Du Bois's rethinking of categories for understanding capital and capitalist processes might be understood. And so that's something that I really was deeply influenced by. And similarly, that the questions that emerge from you rightfully identify as the Black radical tradition, drawing upon Cedric Robinson in that framing, really demand a radical rethinking of the way in which Blackness, anti-Blackness, and capitalism interact with one another on really a global scale. And so those are concerns that animate the project in many different ways, and inspire aspects of the project. And it's such a tremendous and dynamically existing and also contemporary in the present transforming field that I think is just of fundamental importance.
You argue that the period between the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833 and the process of emancipation that began in 1863 in the United States was marked by three interrelated processes that articulated racial formation, colonial occupation, and capitalist development on a global scale. What were these processes, and how did these processes build on or undermine each other?
Yeah, so you're exactly right that a central ambition of Trouble of the World is to, return to the period of explosive crisis and upheaval between Black emancipation in the British Empire, or emancipation across the British Empire, and Black emancipation in the United States. to understand how really U.S. slavery exploded to a kind of like vastness hitherto unseen and was really propelled forward by the outrush of slavery-produced commodities to Britain, to continental Europe, and beyond. To understand how, in so many different ways, through that, Britain also looked towards its empire to see different colonial sites and colonial projects that might meet the kind of or match or surpass the economic dynamism of U.S. slavery. And so, in that concern, I do try to identify three interrelated tendencies within capitalism's really production of and operation through racial domination and colonial occupation. And so those first three tendencies, really the first entails projects to perpetuate plantation societies through the elaboration of new forms of coercion and bondage. The second tendency really involved the pursuit of all white settler societies or white racial ethno-states based upon indigenous dispossession and black removal. Really in projects to make what we're seeing as new white men's countries. And, the third tendency was defined by projects to racially arrange, dispossess, and dominate work through the capitalist marketplace. And, this last tendency operated through the making of a false choice, which I think was drawn so starkly in post-slavery context between the compulsion to work for wages or produce commodities to sell on the marketplace or otherwise suffer from destitution. And so it's through those three tendencies, which I see as kind of like unfolding through concretely through interrelated histories ranging from South Asia to Australia to the United States to Belize to Britain. And I try to kind of like understand kind of like the dynamics of capitalism in this era. So.
Yeah, and it was really interesting to me how at times the tension, particularly between the project of constructing plantation agriculture on a world scale on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to create white man's countries and white ethno states came into conflict with each other, and that's something that we're going to talk about more when we talk about your Queensland chapter. But I think that it's interesting that these processes can not only be complementary, but can also be self or mutually undermining at times, depending on the political dynamics in the particular location. A problem that consistently comes up is, where are capitalists going to find people to work on their plantations and work hard for low or no wages and low upkeep? And so many times we're going to see throughout this book that they don't really succeed in finding an answer to that question because the plantation system is just a really difficult social system to make work. So you begin the book, though, by arguing that we should take seriously W.E.B. Du Bois's insistence that slavery itself was defined by the reduction of Black humanity to the status of real estate. Describe the differences between the chattel principle, which is usually the way that slavery is analyzed in U.S. history, and the real estate principle. And how does this reframing of slavery as real estate connect to the broader themes of the book?
Yeah. So when kind of like thinking about the first part of the book and the way in which I guess wanted to understand the internal dynamics of slavery and represent some of U.S. slavery's really unique violence, I of course was looking towards authors like Du Bois, and especially Du Bois, to consider how he framed, histories of U.S. slavery expansion in the mid-19th century. And one thing that comes out in the kind of like beginning of Black Reconstruction is this quote, which you highlighted, which is that, no matter how degraded the factory hand might be, he, and that's Du Bois's language, he is not real estate. And so for Du Bois, and this kind of like occurs throughout Black Reconstruction in different moments, Du Bois emphasizes the real estate character of U.S. slavery. And that just really stood out to me after I kind of recognized it. And I began to think more deeply about what that terminological switch might be and mean and signal, I guess. And, I even did a little bit of research in the Du Bois papers to find out that, at one point, an editor changed every reference that Du Bois made to real estate to chattel, as you note. And Du Bois writes back and says, this was done in error because real estate is of great and fundamental significance in my understanding of U.S. slavery. And I think that, it just made me consider that this is, a really dramatic reframing of terms and terminology to understand slavery's particular operation within capitalism, which is, a major concern of Black Reconstruction, and to redefine kind of the concepts that might be used to understand that. At least that's the area of emphasis that I became increasingly interested in. And I think, drawing upon the implications of Du Bois's argument about real estate forces a reconsideration about both the particularities of U.S. slavery in the mid-19th century and also of its kind of like complex and caustic dynamic with indigenous dispossession and settler colonial expansion in the United States. So, in this era, settler slavery really expands to a new scale, unprecedented in many different ways, through kind of U.S. imperial acquisition of territory and through the expansion of slavery simultaneously. And real estate, I think, as connected to land and enslavement and through Du Bois's kind of like concepts, offers at least one way to understand that dynamism.
With the real estate thing, I want to see if I'm understanding your point correctly. Particularly that quote was so interesting about the difference between the factory hand and the slave, because this is a common feature of usually white Marxist writing to compare the white worker in the 19th century to a slave and calling him a wage slave. And an important contribution of the Black radical tradition is to say, no, these were distinct things, right? But with the real estate principle, it's that that made me think of how um, the lives of Black people under slavery were capitalized and were used as um, uh, collateral for debt obligations and for raising capital. And in that sense, slaves very much were like the land that they worked, and in some cases were attached to that land or passed down in the family in the same way that an estate might be. Is that really at the core of the difference between real estate and chattel slavery?
In the legal sense, yes. And I think you have really identified it. I think, though, that one thing that I suspect is the case is that Du Bois's use of real estate is really not just defined by the kind of legal categorization, but also about a way to understand better and, I guess, describe better the predicament of enslaved people in the mid-19th century United States. And I think that's why, this emphasis here of kind of like, no matter how degraded the factory hand might be, the factory hand is not real estate, is really trying to identify more than any kind of like legal definition, some of the unique dynamics that define the particular experiences of enslaved people. And elsewhere, later in that same quote, Du Bois also makes an interesting and important comparison to Asian indentured labor, and in the same way to try to, depict, and I think you're right, to write back against a white Marxist tendency that existed, not just in the present, or exists not just in the present, but also is very, prominent in the 1930s as well, to kind of, erase differences between conditions.
Your second chapter deals with how free trade between Britain and the United States influence patterns of indigenous dispossession and slave trading within the U.S. Could you elaborate on that relationship? Um, what were the linkages between increasing trade relations between Britain and the U.S., which we can come to regard as sort of inter-imperial relations at this point, as the U.S. is beginning to expand its colonization of Western territories? And how did that transaction between these two imperial entities produce changes within the U.S. itself.
Yeah, so, a central concern in this chapter is really tracing out how, this mid 19th century is often kind of like characterized as the era of free trade and British liberalism and, British liberal free trade policy. And one thing that, stood out to me, about this era, and, others have also noted this, is that, 1846, which is kind of like the height of the passage of trade liberalization policies in the British Empire, the sort of repeal of the Corn Laws, there's also in coordination the passage of a series of tariff reduction policies in the United States, especially around cotton tariffs and taxes, essentially. And also, outside of the United States, kind of like a British equalization of sugar duties through the Sugar Duties Act. And here, I think that through all of these tariff reduction policies, you see kind of like not free trade policy kind of like superseding slavery, racial slavery in the mid-19th century, but actually facilitating its expansion and operating in relation. And I mean, that's definitely the case in the United States. And that mutual coordination, I think, is just one element of, the argument of the book, which is to, kind of ask that we think differently about this era, that scholars of this era think differently about it and think a little bit more about not necessarily Britain and the United States and, kind of like British liberalism or British freedom in opposition to kind of the global pursuits of U.S. slaveholders, but actually rather really kind of like toxically self-sustaining through capitalism particularly.
After you start with these chapters on the U.S. and the relations between the U.S. and Britain, the second section of the book moves to India and talking about how the British colonial state attempted to induce and then compel Indian smallholders to shift to large-scale production of commodities like indigo, rice, and cotton so as to create an alternative source of supply to the slaveholding U.S. South. The shift of indigo production from South Carolina to colonial India seemed to be the harbinger of a broader shift in commodity production from the slaveholding U.S. South to free labor, with free in quotations, right, in colonial India. Yet attempts to introduce Carolina rice and American cotton varieties to India seemed to founder. Why were efforts to mass produce rice and cotton in India unsuccessful, whereas indigo was successfully outcompeted there? And I want to pay particularly attention to the expectations that of British capitalists that, oh, well, free labor will definitely outcompete slavery. What underlied that expectation?
Yeah. So a complicated but really important question. So you're right. The book really does examine how, a series of colonial projects dreamed up often by colonial bureaucrats to introduce slavery-produced commodities across the British Empire from, rice, Carolina rice to U.S. cotton staples, in some instances indigo, really did not match the kind of like, dreams and expectations of those bureaucrats. Or in different ways, actually, abolitionists who often saw colonial agriculture as outstripping U.S. slavery and transforming the world into one based entirely upon free labor. And I think that, the reasons that each of these projects fail or founder have kind of their own histories and logics to them. But I think I'd just highlight that, so often the kind of like colonial visions of bureaucrats were also, kind of like extremely harebrained and in a different way, abolitionists or for abolitionists, such visions of freedom through colonial commodity production ran up against really a reality of the resilience of racial slavery as a regime outside of shifts in commodity production. But even as efforts maybe to introduce Carolina rice into India were disrupted and failed, or efforts to introduce U.S. cotton staples, drawing upon U.S. overseers to India, failed and foundered, I also think that they created a new way of kind of like British colonial looking towards empire and what empire might operate, what empire might do, what colonies might do for empire. And so, in this sense, even kind of the really kind of like fastening onto India of a set of ways of obligations to increasingly produce commodities for export in it, or export rather, for their own success, I could say, or in the sense of for imperial projects, because it was about kind of like the subordination of colonies to metropolitan demands. And so I think that even in that way of looking towards the success or failure of these projects, new obligations were really fastened onto the colonial world.
This just these chapters made me think so much about what's going on in the global South right now with land grabs and attempts to en masse reorganize legal and institutional and social frameworks and relations in order to uh, increase the production of monocrop agricultural commodities in especially in places like sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other parts of the global South, and the destabilizing consequences these projects, these speculative projects of trying to buy up land and redirect its orientation to export agriculture have had on politics and economics and societies and in the global South. I think that this is kind of a continuity I see, even though obviously slavery has formally been abolished in the world economy. These patterns and strategies of imperial and colonial rule, even though they work through different institutional frameworks nowadays, I think that there is strong elements of continuity there.
Yeah,
Um,
and just to say one thing briefly on that point is I think it's, that's the resonance between the mid 19th century and the kind of like present is not just a coincidence or incidental, but it's that this period in the mid 19th century is one in which a whole series of new forms of domination and coercion, colonial occupation are really experimented with and refined in ways that no doubt have resonance into the present.
Absolutely. Um, so this the failure to mass produce cotton and Carolina rice in India has become a flashpoint in the often heated scholarly debate over the history of capitalism and especially the role of slavery in capitalism. Between economic historians who have economics PhDs and who are grounded in a marginalist, rational actor, market centered view of the world, on the one hand, and historians of capitalism who have history PhDs and have a broader, more sociological understanding of how the economy works. Certainly a more Marx inflected, but also drawing on other kind of broader social theories of the economy. Your argument in these chapters, the efforts to import methods of organizing plantation production from the US South, founded on the shoals of a vastly different social system and the limited ability of white colonial planters in India to coerce Indian peasants to produce these crops, falls squarely in the history of capitalism camp. In your view, what are some of the weaknesses with the economist's approach, which posits that the failure of American seeds in India's soil and climate conditions explains, and here I'm particularly referring to Alan Olmsted and Paul Rhodes. Paul Rhodes's work, and they're two of the most vocal critics from the economist camp of the history of capitalism research. Um, uh, what do you think are some of the shortcomings of that alternative approach to explaining the failure of mass produced cotton and rice for export in India?
Yeah, so I think that you know the way that I would look at and frame this question might be just slightly different
Right.
than the way that you did, but I think it's a really important one nonetheless. And I would say that in writing these three chapters that we're really discussing about different uh, histories through commodities that connected the United States and colonial India in different way, I was really influenced by a lot of really tremendous scholarship in agrarian studies on South Asia, and I think that work um, has been overlooked in some of the scholarship that you just mentioned, and I think that scholarship really kind of focuses or demands a little bit greater focus on regional particularities, of course, but also upon the ways in which smallhold cultivators were often able, through a variety of means, to disrupt the plans of the colonial state. So it's really, I think, that is something that is maybe underemphasized in that literature. And I think that at the same time, in the posing of kind of like the two camps of kind of like the new history of capitalism against kind of the new economic history, I think that framing really had a little bit more salience a few years ago than it does now. And I think now the ways in which approaches to capitalism, colonialism, and empire are unfolding through new historical scholarship I'm speaking of here particularly is really compelling and kind of like disrupts that binary. So I guess maybe it's scholarship that we could say is in a third camp. And here, there's so many great works. I'd just note two great books by Andrew Liu and Aaron Jakes in this regard that have been recently published. So, but to go back a little bit to the point about the ways in which smallhold cultivators, for example, often disrupted these projects. In one moment that I think had great resonance with me in working on the book is this kind of in between 1839 and 1849, 10 U.S. plantation overseers are recruited by the British colonial state to engage in projects to introduce cotton cultivation and Carolina rice cultivation as well. One overseer in particular is in North India and is engaged in every effort to kind of like reproduce means of coercion drawing upon U.S. slavery. And at one moment, the overseer is, in dialogue with smallhold cultivator who basically says to him, "You have no power over me, and uh, it's not your will that will change anything. It's really the will of Ram that I'll follow essentially, and that will follow." And it's those moments of disruption that I think are important to also note to kind of like understand differences between U.S. slavery and colonial agrarian projects in India, even as they became drawn more tightly together. I mean, when overseers relocate, one overseer, one of the first kind of Hindi terms he learns is zabardasti, which essentially means violence, force, and oppression. And en route to India from Egypt, purchases a whip, in fact, made from hippopotamus hide. And so it is all part of his intention to, as others say, kind of like become new planting elites in India, but they're disrupted constantly, and not only by smallhold cultivators, but also by landlords who see these overseers as really, completely seen to kind of like supersede their own power and are challenged in that way. So it's from inability to seize control of colonial agrarian relations, essentially. I would say so.
Yeah, and I think that this kind of deeper institutional reality that gets in the way of transporting methods of production from one context to another is something that, ironically, the new institutional economics is sometimes not very good at picking up on, because it has a very thin understanding of the institutions that determine economic decision making and um, um, livelihood strategies that peasants use. I think that you mentioned this agrarian studies scholarship on India. I think that in general, certainly social scientists would do well to read more agrarian studies scholarship, because it portrays agrarian social relations in a much more complex, as being a much more complex world than I think a lot of the simplified abstract models of social scientists pick up on and understand in a lot
Yeah.
of cases.
And just in addition to that, I completely agree. Another just kind of great work to highlight, that I think even like forces some rethinking of the work of agrarian studies is Niladri Bhattacharya's great, recently published book, The Great Agrarian Conquest, which I think, offers a way to um, better understand how colonial rule and occupation unfolded through agrarian conquest, but in a way that's quite different from the expansion of U.S. settler slavery in the 19th century United States, nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. Um, so the third section is still in India, but focused on the global connections during the crises, the interlocking crises of the 1860s. And here we turn to the Lancashire cotton famine, as it was called at the time and is still referred to in a lot of historical scholarship, and the relation between the cotton famine, the U.S. Civil War, which of course disrupted cotton exports from the United States, and the actual famine that occurred in northwest in the Northwest province in India in the 1860s. You argue that the depression in Lancashire's textile industry in the 1860s had more to do with the collapse of textile imports in India than the collapse of cotton imports from the U.S. into Lancashire during this period. Why did the fortunes of Lancashire textile producers depend on markets in India?
Yeah. So, in this era, it's, sometimes described as the period when Britain is increasingly becoming the workshop of the world. And what that entails is, of course, the export of goods from British manufacturing to places globally, and particularly to sites across the British Empire, and in this instance, particularly to India's northwestern provinces, which is really regarded in this era as probably the most significant outlet for Manchester goods. And so, we have to think geographically about how capitalism is, existing in this era. And so, on the one hand, we have cotton being exported in unprecedented amounts from the United States to metropolitan Britain. That cotton is then transformed into textiles, which are exported globally, and again, particularly to India's northwestern provinces. And so, I think a common kind of history of this era suggests that the Confederate blockade of the blockade of southern ports, rather, which stops the movement of cotton from the United States to Britain, is the cause of crisis in Lancashire's textile industry. But that rendering doesn't actually really account in any way at all for the kind of like devastating famine that occurs in India's northwestern provinces in 1860, which leads to mass displacement and mass death, with some estimates up to, perhaps 1 million people dying from the famine. And so that famine itself actually disrupts the kind of like consumption of Manchester goods. And, factory owners at the time, in Lancashire, for example, are writing about just how significant this disruption is. And so in the book, I wanted to take, that seriously because A, it's part of historical reality, and B, because it, I think, forces a little bit of a rethinking in the way in which relations of capitalism are understood in this era, and crisis are understood in this era, and that that India and the practices of colonialism in India and markets in India are dramatically disrupting capitalism, as well as is recognized in so much of the kind of like kind of like primary sources from the era, whether it be from factory owners or heads of the Manchester Chamber of Commerce, or whether it be from heads of the Bengal Chamber of Commerce. So it's something that's widely documented in the era.
Um, you write about how in representations of the Lancashire cotton famine, even framing it in terms of a famine, um, there was an equivalence created between the cotton famine in the northwest of England and the actual famine in India and British public opinion. What were the colonial and racial ideologies at work that created this equivalence, and how did it influence disaster relief measures and colonial state policies?
Yeah. So this is a really important point, and an example of kind of some of the questions that you were raising earlier as well. I think of like, why a focus on the history of the economy is not the same as kind of like a history of the focus, a history of capitalism per se. And I think here, the kind of racial and colonial ideologies that brought the Lancashire cotton famine and famine in India's northwestern provinces together are really important to unpack. So these two famines in British metropolitan and imperial discourse increasingly become rendered as a kindred distress, and that's the language that's used at the time. And it's not kindred distress in the sense that to emphasize the way in which the economic relations are manifesting themselves simultaneously within the crisis, but rather to say that the suffering, and again, this is within the kind of like colonial rhetoric of those devastated by famine in India's northwestern provinces, is fundamentally the same as mass unemployment in Lancashire's textile industries. And through this language of kindred distress and comparable suffering, there are actual real material transformations that occur. So a lot of famine relief funds that are organized in India's northwestern provinces. Some of the remaining funds, which are called surplus funds, are sent to Lancashire's both like kind of to the Manchester Chamber of Commerce and to support relief efforts in Manchester. And so here we have the actual transfer of money from first kind of like collected to support those suffering from famine in North India to support unemployed workers in metropolitan Britain. And I mean, those types of equivalents, I think, really help us understand the way in which the economy in this era is, hierarchically, racially, and colonially organized, I would say. So.
Um, when metropolitan Britain came to believe that colonial India did not meet its imperial obligation to surpass U.S. slavery in the production of cotton and other commodities, India's weavers, merchants, and peasants were judged, you write, as failures who required further imperial intervention in the forms of discipline and domination, while the burden of ongoing capitalist crisis was further displaced from Britain and imposed onto the subcontinent. This belief in India's failure to produce cotton to supply Britain's textile industry pivoted on concerns about the quality of the supply of cotton that Indian farmers and merchants were providing for the British. British textile producers believed that Indian cotton was less pure than their American counterparts. This concern about quality also enters into economic historians' explanation for the failure of cotton production in India during this period as well. Yet, as sociologists like Pierre Bourdieu teach us, classification is not a neutral, objective act. It is informed by prejudice, ideology, internalized beliefs. How are these classifications of cotton quality shaped by concerns about, for example, the honesty of Indian merchants or the work ethic of peasants?
Yeah, the questions of quality actually animate a lot of concerns throughout the book, not only in the chapters that you cited here, but also earlier, those on
Right.
indigo and Carolina rice as well. And so I just first want to say that in general, when first working on the project as a dissertation, I didn't really think that much about those questions. But as I continued to kind of reflect upon the material, also think about what is going on in the literature, it really made me recognize why at least beginning to think more dynamically about the question of quality was necessary, thinking about kind of like the cultural logic and racial logic of quality within capitalism and in interpretations of commodity and forms of commodity fetishism seemed absolutely essential. And so, that concern actually first became animated in the chapter on Carolina Rice that I worked on. And at one
Right.
moment,
And that's why it's called Carolina rice, because rice from
exactly.
Carolina was considered of premium quality compared to rice from South Asia, among other places, right?
Exactly. And the point there is that, you're right. It's not a neutral or objective act, but it's a lot about kind of like associations and cultural logics that are being defined within imperial culture, particularly. So, a question that I was concerned with is why was there such a demand for slavery-produced commodities, and why was that demand so firmly attached within kind of British metropolitan society upon to U.S. slavery? And of course, there are aspects of the realities of production and consumption that are at play. And so, in the example of Carolina Rice, the reduced shipping distance, the particular process of milling does perhaps lend some credence to an idea that Carolina rice, when consumed within metropolitan Britain, could be perhaps fresher. But there's no real basis to fully understand that, but that element is there. But at the same time, there's also kind of the fantasies and demands for slavery produce that are circulating. I think that's of extreme importance. And so to carry that argument on to cotton staples, it is probably even a little bit more the case, perhaps, than in the example of Carolina rice, that there are certain aspects of the production process and factory production in particular that make U.S. cotton staples more easy to work upon than those imported from South Asia. But as that reality is sort of interpreted within metropolitan Britain, it's all of a sudden cast as the racial failure of India to meet its colonial obligations. The inability, as you kind of rightly say, about the dishonest merchant and the kind of lack of work ethic of smallhold cultivators or peasants. And those are, colonial tropes that are circulating at ever greater frequency during this era, and with increasing hostility, and also, has to be understood as well in the immediate context of the aftermath of the Indian Rebellion, too. So I think that, it's a period of the reformation of a new and continuously vicious British imperial racism toward India, and its inability in the rhetoric of colonial officials of India to meet its colonial obligations. So.
Um, so you write that the burden of the textile crisis was displaced onto India, and this jumped out at me because I noticed that you cite David Harvey's work, The Limits to Capital, and his sort of spatial theory of capitalism's crises, and I feel like that influence starts to come through in your discussion of the relationship between the Lancashire cotton crisis and the colonial states' policies in India, and the attempts to displace the burdens of risk involved in speculative ventures onto the subcontinent. So I would like you to elaborate a little more on what you mean when you say that the burden of ongoing capitalist crisis was further displaced from Britain and imposed onto the subcontinent during this period.
Yeah, so this is, of course, as you rightfully cite, an area where, and here I'm thinking particularly of crisis theories, where Marxist scholarship is, really rich and important to engage with. And of course, David Harvey's work, which is important in this regard, but also, it's much deeper tradition as well, which I know you know, but including the work of Heinrich Grossman on crisis theory. That just thinking in relation to that helped me better understand some of the economic dynamics unfolding in this era, as well as the actual writing that Rosa Luxemburg did on the formation of crisis in this era. So just wanted to first highlight that. But to return to your question of how the burden of the textile crisis was displaced onto India, I think it's first a little bit necessary to understand sometimes how this history is portrayed. The history of the crisis is portrayed. So there's kind of like sometimes a belief that cotton production was dramatically and fundamentally transformed and expanded in India in this early era. And I think the reality is a little bit more complex. And in fact, there's a huge redirection of cotton from places such as, in particularly Western India, to metropolitan Britain. And, as that redirected flow of cotton, it really has a tremendous impact upon textile workers, weavers in different parts of India, and particularly North India, which is very same region that's so dramatically impacted by famine. And, there's a lot of observations about just how devastating this is, for North Indian weavers and the economy that circulate amongst reports of colonial officials in this era. So, it's not a secret or anything like that. And in fact, in many instances, colonial officials trying to make sense of how this crisis is unfolding in different places, such as North India, say that in many ways it's necessary to think of North Indian weavers as, and a direct quote here, fellow laborers, along with the kind of like unemployed English factory worker, but fellow workers who are even more disproportionately impacted because of the way in which cotton is being redirected to metropolitan Britain. And so, I think I mentioned earlier that I thought it was really necessary to see how and a little bit better understand how the crisis, the origins of the crisis could be traced to famine in North India in 1860. At the same time, I also wanted to kind of like understand different ways that, disruptions in cotton supply as caused by Black emancipation in the United States, or the U.S. Civil War, I should say, also had an impact not only upon cotton producers, and I guess smallhold cultivators and peasants in and across India, but also upon weavers, for example, which is a history that I think would often really not be analyzed. And there's other reports that sort of note that weavers are really taken up into, kind of like Asian indentured labor schemes in this era because of their displacement from work. So I just think those histories of crisis are also really important to understand when we think about this era really outside of its North Atlantic frame, and as a crisis of capitalism, not simply in a crisis within capitalism, and not simply a raw material crisis alone or a cotton crisis alone.
So your next chapter moves from India to Australia, and you're interested in other attempts by British imperial officials and colonial states within the British Empire to continue to find other sources of cotton and to create other plantations out of landscapes that are inhabited by or taken from indigenous peoples. And so you focus in particular in your chapter on Australia on the state of Queensland, which is in northern Australia. Uh, and This chapter highlights a contradiction that we touched on a little bit earlier in white settler colonial projects. And this is also a contradiction that comes up in debates over the expansion of the United States and which territories to incorporate as states and which territories to either allow to be independent or to incorporate as basically colonies, right? On the one hand, the production of commodities for export, especially on plantations, required cheap labor that could be stripped of rights and coerced, which is to say non-white labor. But on the other hand, white settlers did not want the security threats or the competition for land that came with large non-white populations. How did these tensions shape the politics of colonization and labor in Queensland?
Yeah, so I think that, here again, um, this is a history where histories of white supremacy and settler colonialism, histories of racism, and histories of capitalism essentially exist in, as they so often do, in contradiction with in a series of contradictions, and also where different colonial projects, as imagined by different, kind of like colonial officials, have very different possible outcomes. And so to state how that unfolds in the kind of like schemes for the colonization of Queensland that emerged in the 1860s, I think, it's necessary to understand the kind of different colonial interests, essentially. So on the one hand, there is a very active Queensland immigration official who's really imagining transforming Queensland into an all-white settler colony and settler society. And his vision really depends particularly upon the relocation of unemployed Lancashire workers to Queensland, where they are, in this vision, intended to relocate, buy textiles on the one hand, and also produce cotton on the other hand, and remain forever. So it's a white settler colonial project that sees kind of the crisis in capitalism as a fix for the kind of like extended and extensive white settler colonization of Queensland. On the other hand, there are a series of planter interests that essentially say that such schemes are, ultimately not going to work, and instead either Asian indentured labor, particularly perhaps from China, or South Pacific Island labor should be drawn upon. And these schemes are kind of unfolding in relation to one another and widely debated within the kind of settler press of the era. And at the same time, in each aspect of that debate, they are, settlers and planters are drawing upon different kind of forms of meaning from black emancipation on the one hand in the United States, and more directly the U.S. Civil War. And so the pro-white settler uh, kind of like colony faction is saying that, making an all-white colony is going to lead to kind of like white supremacist all white harmony without kind of any without black presence, without kind of like Asian presence, and of course without Aboriginal or Indigenous presence. And those projects ultimately are challenged not only, and ultimately disrupted not only by planting interests that see the need for the kind of like most readily available and least expensive labor possible, but also by British factory owners themselves, who say that we ought to have a right to control or at least limit the movement of laborers. And so these schemes that are drawing upon funds to relocate the workers that are ultimately reducing, the presence of which are reducing the wages in metropolitan Britain, should be disallowed. And so it's much longer and more elaborate history than those contours just sketched out. But I think in those contours, we can begin to see once again how a whole set of contradictions within capitalism, colonialism, and racialization unfold in kind of like concrete historical space.
You're The next part of the book moves back to the Western Hemisphere, and here we start moving into the post-British Emancipation Caribbean, and you talk about how actually in the case of Belize that you talk about. This is also a period after U.S. emancipation when a large number of Southern planter families emigrate from the U.S. South to what was then called British Honduras in order to try to increase plantation production at the behest of the colonial state there. But once again, they ran into the similar difficulty of trying to find people to work on the plantations who they could control. Why did the planters turn to Chinese indentured labor in particular? What other possibilities did they consider? And why did this ultimately fail to solve the plantation labor problem in a sustainable way?
Yeah, so this is, another example of a way in which kind of the unfolding of slavery and emancipation in the United States intersects with projects for British colonial expansion, and as you mentioned, in this instance, in British Honduras. And so, what happens in the 1860s essentially is that there is two very large landholding companies that are looking towards different ways to, strengthen and revive the economy of British Honduras, and also to increase the value of land. And so they are envisioning different forms of labor recruitment schemes even before the outbreak of the American Civil War. And so their eyes first turn toward Asian indentured labor, again, both from India and China. And then in the midst of really the unfolding of Black emancipation in the United States, and slightly before as well, there's a whole series of projects to recruit formerly enslaved people from the United States to kind of settle and do the work of plantation labor, essentially. And those schemes are actually go much further than one might expect, reaching up all the way to Abraham Lincoln, and also have long legs, we'll say, that connect with kind of U.S. colonization projects, but are ultimately disrupted, I would argue, because of the interests of formerly enslaved people themselves to remain in the United States. And so when those projects are disrupted, these same landholding interests and British colonial officials then return to both Asian indentured labor and subsequently to former U.S. slaveholders to do the work of colonization and plantation management. And so the first and really only ship of indentured laborers from China arrives in British Honduras in 1865 with over 400 indentured laborers aboard, and the experience of those laborers is brutal in the extreme, in the kind of forms of coercion and violence that unfold after just the first year. I believe nearly or over 100 people die. There's a mass absconding from plantations where over 100 more Chinese laborers actually in some ways join with the Santa Cruz Maya, and the leader of the Santa Cruz Maya in this era, Belsen, when contacted by British officials to seek their return, kind of memorably refuses, saying that this is not possible because the Chinese are Indians like himself. And in some ways, you see the kind of re-articulation and redrawing of lines of racial solidarity against empire in this era, but it's also a project where Belsen has his own interest in labor as well. It should probably be noted, or at least would seem that way. But then, in part because of this ongoing conflict, and in kind of tandem with, there's a belief that U.S. slaveholders who are war hardened after the Civil War, who are seeking in some ways refuge, are going to provide the perfect new settler class, because they will not only be able to manage plantations, which has constantly been disrupted, but also and significantly do work to colonize, to secure the border, and to disrupt the Maya in kind of ongoing border conflicts. And so here again, I think we have histories of settler colonization and capitalism unfolding in quite dynamic and caustic interrelation.
Um, okay, so I think that this is a good time to wrap up. But I do want to ask you before we go, what is your next project? What are you working on now?
So I'm, just in the very early stages of working on a new project that is, sort of tentatively entitled Speculation Against Insurgency, that explores early histories of U.S. slave trading in the kind of early United States in relation to kind of African diasporic rebellion and uprising, and particularly in the United States, to understand the long legacies of U.S. involvement in the transatlantic slave trade.
Well, that sounds fascinating. Thank you so much, Zach, for joining me today. This was a terrific book. I highly recommend it. The book, once again, is "The Trouble of the World: Slavery and Empire in the Age of Capital," freshly released from the University of North Carolina Press. Thank you so much, Zach.
Thanks again. It's been terrific.